Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.
The interview series, Reflections in Time, was begun by the late Professor Paul Borghi more than 20 years ago. This new series continues Paul's work and is dedicated to his memory. This is how Paul began many of the 73 interviews that he recorded. It's often exciting to look at the future of UNO, what it might be like in times to come. Sometimes, though, it's important to stop and take a look at the past of the university, the people and the happenings that helped make the excitement of future history possible. With this in mind, join me for Reflections in Time. My name's Jack Newton. I'm retired now, but I'm still active as a professor emeritus. I've been on the faculty of UN Omaha since 1960, and I served for 20 years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. I worked closely with Professor Borghi in the development of his original interview series, and I can think of no more fitting tribute to him than to continue this work. Well, it's a snowy morning in the 1st of December, the year 2000. We're here in the studios of KYNE Television on the campus of University of Nebraska at Omaha. And I have as my guest this morning Professor John Farr. Dr. Farr is currently Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at UNO, a job that he's held for a good many years. He's also Dean of the College of Continuing Studies, a job that he hasn't had for that long, but a significant one nonetheless. John, welcome. We're glad to have you here with us.
Jack, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I remember when Paul started the series of interviews a long time ago, and I thought it was a wonderful idea then. There's a lot of history to this university, and certainly it's a history of the people who have been here. So I'm very, very happy to participate.
We're glad to have you here too. I'm going to ask you a little bit about yourself, but before we do that, I introduced you as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. I know what that is, I think, but I'm not sure that people who aren't associated with academic institutions do. Could you, just in a nutshell, tell me what that job is?
Well, it changes from time to time, Jack, but most of what I do involves the curriculum, the review of the curriculum, development of new curricula, and at least helping faculty and deans to do that and get it through the various approval processes. I work with the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs on a wide variety of things that he is involved in. Developing, preparing items for the Board of Regents, and in general supporting the Vice Chancellor's work.
And you work pretty closely with all of the deans too.
Oh yes. I try to be of assistance when they have problems and need information about how to work an item through the various university approval processes.
Well, we'll come back and talk more about that later, but I just wanted to get a little head start there so that people would know what we're talking about when we talk about your title.
Great.
Let's start in talking a little bit about you. You know, I know something about you. I know that you come from Texas, but I don't think I've ever taken time to explore your roots really. Could you tell us a little bit about where you come from?
Well, I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas. Graduated from Texas Christian University in 1959. Got a master's degree there the following year. tried a
those
year of
degrees
law school.
in political science? That's your...
Actually, the bachelor's degree was in journalism, the master's in political science. Tried a year of law school, but that wasn't really my cup of tea. So I went to the University of Texas at Austin. Got my PhD there in 1969 after a 2-year stint in the Army, and then came here in February of 1969.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about that. Did you how did you get interested in political science, since that's the field that you ended up in?
Somehow I was just always interested in politics, and of course in Texas, politics is one of the favorite indoor sports, and certainly it is this year in particular. Journalism, I always enjoyed writing, and journalism was a natural for me, but politics just had a special interest, and I gravitated in that area. At that time, I was also interested in international politics. The Soviet Union was a major force in world affairs, and so I became quite interested in that. But you know, we're all attracted by something perhaps we really cannot explain, and for me, politics was that thing.
But were you always an observer and analyst, or did you actually get involved in running for office? Or?
Well, I never ran for office, but I did help out one time in Jim Wright's unsuccessful campaign for a Senate seat in Texas. But generally, it's always been as an observer. Of course, there's a little bit of politics associated with the university, as all of us know, and I suppose I have been a participant in that arena.
Well, I could make endless comments on that, John.
Yes,
but,
yes.
I think we both could probably. You mentioned that you had a stint in the Army. Could you about what year was that?
Well, I was in the Army between 1965 and 67.
So that was right at the end of the Korean War?
No, that was during the Vietnam.
Yeah, Vietnam War, yes.
Vietnam War.
I was thinking 55, yeah. 65, 10 years later.
Yes, I had a commission, an ROTC commission in the Military Police Corps.
Now, you don't look mean enough to be a military policeman.
Well, fortunately, I had a lot of good sergeants and other enlisted people who could do that part of the job. Actually, I started out in a military police battalion at Fort Hood, Texas, and I was called to another assignment. The services were gearing up, building up in Vietnam, and so as a military police officer, I was assigned to form up a dog training detachment.
Now, there's got to be a story behind that.
Well, there's a little bit of a story. I confess, a dog lover, always have been, and ever since I was a kid, we've had one or more. In Austin, my wife trained in obedience our Pekingese. We had one initially, then two. We lived in an apartment overlooking the parking lot of a Jewish synagogue. And so in the evening, she would go out and train, or maybe the right way to say it is attempt to train, our Pekingese.
And I'm trying to form a mental image of a Pekingese going through an obedience class. It's a little hard image to form.
Well, it really is, and it was certainly an ambitious experiment for my wife at the time, and one never really quite knew who was training whom. Anyway, when I went in the Army, I filled out all of these forms, and one of the questions was, what are your hobbies? So I indicated, well, stamp collecting, which was my hobby. And then I didn't want to stop with just one, so I put dog training, since I did enjoy watching Lynn train our Pekingese. So, as luck would have it, when they were looking for somebody to take over this dog training detachment, they saw that that was one of my interests, and lo and behold, I was assigned to form up this 9-person dog training detachment. Luckily, all the other people knew more about it than I did. We formed up the unit at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, and then went to Okinawa to train dogs for service in Vietnam. Primarily, we were training dogs that had seen service in Vietnam. Their handlers had been rotated back to other assignments after a year there, and we would retrain the dogs with other handlers and then send the dogs and handlers to Vietnam. That was a fascinating year for me, and it was just a wonderful assignment.
Now, no, I won't ask that. I was going to say, did your experience training dogs have any carryover to your later experience as a college professor? But I shouldn't ask that question.
No, you really shouldn't, because you know, it's not a really good analogy. You've heard of the herding cat,
yes, right.
Analogy, and you know, I think you as dean have probably compared deaning to that. And I think dogs are a little bit easier in that regard, but I don't think there has really been much of a carryover. Although, in a way, the handlers and the trainers who really did work with the dogs knew their stuff, and fortunately I had a lot of wonderful people who served with me and who made sure that those dogs and handlers were ready for what they did in Vietnam.
Now, your PhD was in political science at the University of Texas,
yes,
which we can both agree is a great institution, since I have a son who got a PhD down there too.
Yes.
And you said you had an interest in the Soviet Union. Was your dissertation research and so on, was that did that deal with the Soviet Union?
My dissertation dealt with the withering away of the state in the Soviet Union. One of the Marxist-Leninist propositions was that ultimately the state would wither away. And for a time, Khrushchev was talking about this this doctrine and was trying to show that, in effect, that was occurring in the Soviet Union. Well, it wasn't really, although one could say it was, and that the state didn't have the real authority and power. It was vested in the party. But that became a popular tenet for a while. Unfortunately, for my purposes, Khrushchev met his end as the leader of the Soviet Union, and so I was left with a doctrine that the principal practical proponent had left the scene. But that's what I wrote about, and of course, in a way it withered away, but not in a way that Khrushchev at the time was anticipating.
Now, I remember back in the 70s, in fact, you and I were on a trip to the Soviet Union, sponsored by the university here and directed by then Chancellor Roskins. Was that your first time that you traveled there?
Yes, it was.
Was that a good experience?
Oh, it was a very, very good experience. I remember one thing in particular that happened there. I met a Russian at one of the gatherings that we had. This was a meeting with members of what they called the Russian-American Friendship Society or something to that effect. And we all gathered in a hotel and chatted. And I became acquainted with one person, and he said, "Would you like to come visit me in my apartment?" And that sounded like a wonderful opportunity to go to a real person's home and visit with them in an extended way. So we made an appointment, and he picked me up, and we hailed a cab at the corner of a busy intersection, and he gave the person an address, and then after a few blocks he changed the address. I think he gave one address for purposes of whoever might be standing at the corner, and then another one actually to get us there. Well, we arrived at this very Stalinist type apartment building, very gloomy and with several other similar buildings nearby. We went, and he spoke English. We went inside, and he said, inside his apartment, and he said, best not to speak English now. He closed the doors, turned on the television, closed the window blinds, and in effect I thought, my God, what have I gotten myself into? But it was a very, very pleasant visit, and we shared a lot of stories. I tried to send him some American novels because he was interested in Western novels. But I don't know if they ever got there. I never heard from him again. But it was a wonderful inside glimpse into a real live Russian family.
It must have been especially interesting for you since you have that background. Do you speak any Russian?
No, I don't. That was something that I just never was able to pick up.
Well, let's talk about your arrival in Omaha. How did you, was this your first position then?
This was my first position. I've actually finished all of the work on my degree in December of '68. A good friend of mine in the department at Texas was acquainted with Dave Scott, who at that time was chairman of the Department of Political Science here. And as you recall, the fall of 1968 was the first semester after the merger of the old municipal university with the University of Nebraska system. So, and at that time, a number of new positions were made available. Well, Dave had a new line in political science that he wanted to fill. He called Carl Leiden, my friend at Texas, and said, do you know of anybody? Carl gave him my name. Dave called me, and I came up for an interview in early December of 1968. We hit it off. He offered me a position, and but they wanted somebody to come at the beginning of the spring 1969 semester, which at that time started in February. So all of a sudden, I had a job in Omaha. My wife was still in school in Texas, so but I came, and the first week I was here, I saw more snow than I had in my whole life.
Coming up from sunny Austin, Texas, up to the cold climate of Nebraska.
Well, it was 80 degrees when I left Austin. I had ordered snow tires at the Sears store in Austin, and I'm sure they thought, what a nut. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want snow tires in Texas. So they never came. But I bought them in Emporia, Kansas when I encountered my first snowstorm.
Yeah, that must. I hope you had a warm coat, too.
Well, I did. I prepared in that way. And even for a Texan who had not seen any snow to speak of, it wasn't all that bad. Actually, I suppose it was a relatively light winter. I could always drive to campus, and it seemed like the city was perfectly able to handle that unusual natural event.
Well, for those of us who were here when it was the Municipal University of Omaha, that was a pretty exciting time because we had the changeover, and it must have been an exciting time for you too, even though you didn't have the background of having been part of the old university. What was your first impression as you, well, when you came here for an interview? Was it still Municipal University of Omaha when you were being interviewed?
No, that was
okay. The change had already happened.
The change had just occurred, and of course, UNO was a very, very different institution than I had been associated with before. TCU, a residential university, Texas, a large state university. UNO was quite different. It was a commuter campus, and I found it very, very unusual but interesting. and people were very friendly. In fact, I've always felt that Omaha and the people in Omaha reminded me a whole lot of Fort Worth. There was a lot of similarities, and I felt instantly at home here, both in Omaha and at the university.
What was the university like? You mentioned it was a commuter campus and so on, but what were your first impressions?
My first impressions were that this was an institution that was really being created. A new institution was being created out of an older institution. The faculty was being enlarged significantly. People were adapting to a new organizational pattern that some of them were not really accustomed to. There was a spirit of creating something new. And frankly, I have always felt that my time here has been something of an adventure, because the institution has been constantly changing, developing, growing, improving. It's been very exciting to be part of that. Yeah. And you can tell that it was beginning to, well, it had already started to occur, I'm sure, with the events in the summer of 1968, when the municipal university formally became part of the system.
How many people were in the political science faculty back then?
As I recall, there were 6 or 7. Most had been with the department a few years. One had just arrived in the fall of '68, and then in the next few years we added a couple more, so that the size of the faculty, at least at the time I left, was 8 faculty.
Well, somewhere around that time, it decreased in size because the public administration people moved to another to a college that had just been
Yes, around 1969 or 70, and with the creation of the School of Public Affairs and Community Service, the PA faculty decided that when they had 3 people, it would be appropriate for them to move to the new school as a Department of Public Administration, because that would relate more to the mission of CPACs, really, than to the study of political science. A third person came, and the new school was created, and Dave Scott and Harry Reynolds and another individual, then Stan Powers, then moved over to CPACs, and the department there grew and prospered and ultimately became a nationally recognized unit that currently offers a PhD.
How did that work at the time? Was it a kind of an amicable split? Or
oh, yes, yes. It was well known that they were going to move to, we called it then SPACs. It was a school. It was done for development reasons, and all the individuals got along perfectly well at the time. We were all friends and good colleagues, and it was not a matter of people leaving because there were fundamental differences.
What did that do to your curriculum? Did that take courses out of the department that had been taught there? Or?
Well, it took a few public administration courses out of political science, moved them to the new college, but students, as I recall, were still encouraged to take public administration courses. When I went to graduate school, PA and PS were combined in the same department. I think over time, professionally, the practice has been for public administration to have its own department
Sure.
either in an arts and sciences college or in a public affairs college like ours. But I think that any political science student, certainly at the undergraduate level, should be encouraged to make public administration at least a part of his or her studies.
Now, I know it's been a while since you were actively teaching in the political science department, but you certainly kept an eye on them from the office of the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. Can you see any differences now between the department as it exists currently and the department as it existed when you first came here? Differences in curriculum, numbers of students, any of that sort of thing?
Well, I think the faculty are a good deal younger in most cases. The curriculum, I think, has remained to a large extent the same. Certainly new courses have been developed as new faculty have come in with their own approaches and their own specialties. I think there is a greater emphasis on research today, just as there is in the institution at large, than when I came in 1969. It continues to be, I believe, a very strong department, and I follow them with a great deal of interest. But I also have tried, as an administrator, not to become involved in
Sure.
department affairs, and I think that is appropriate.
You always had sort of, with your interest in the Soviet Union, always had sort of an international focus. Is the department focused that way too?
The department certainly does have a strong interest in both comparative politics and in international studies. I don't know the individuals who, or some of the individuals who have that interest today, although of course Professor Bacon, who, as it turned out, replaced me a number of years ago, certainly has continued a very, very strong interest in
Professor Chung
in European
others,
affairs,
yes.
and Professor Chung in Asian politics. I believe one of the new individuals specializes in Latin American politics, as did Professor Kemp.
Right. It's interesting. Well, how long did you spend teaching in the political science department before you switched over to an administrative role?
Well, I was in political science for 5 years, and then a job opened up in the Office of Academic Affairs. Herb Garfinkel had come a year before. They needed an additional person at the assistant.
Herb Garfinkel, of course, was the new, at that time, new Vice Chancellor
Yes.
for Academic Affairs, and a distinguished scholar in political science himself.
Yes.
Major textbook in American government.
He had a strong interest in the Constitution, in constitutional law, in the system of federalism, and so it was really a great pleasure for me to see a distinguished political science come and serve as our first Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. Anyway, the job opened up. I started as a...
What made you, what stimulated your interest in applying for it?
The job basically focused on curriculum, on program review. In fact, my first title was Assistant to the Provost for Program Review. It sounded interesting, and so I went for it and was selected, and it's been fun, and I'm still there. The job has changed a lot over the years, and for a time I also served as acting director of the University Library, and that too was a very interesting
You've had a
assignment.
number of special assignments like that, haven't you?
Well, I have, and they've all been fun.
Yeah. Do you ever miss the classroom, miss that contact with students?
Well, I do. I have always missed the classroom after coming into the office. I taught the first couple of years, but I found that the intensity of the work in an academic affairs office really wasn't very conducive also to trying to to teach.
Imagine
faculty
keeping up with the discipline with the new things going on.
Keeping up with the discipline was difficult too, especially in Soviet politics, where one really does need to keep up with the
things
changes,
changing so quickly.
the specific changes in leadership positions.
I did that myself. I continued to teach as dean, but I found that I could only keep up with one very narrow aspect of my discipline. I couldn't keep up with it.
Well, the last time I taught was in the summer of, I think it was about 75. And I found myself getting up at 4 or 4:30 in the morning to try to prepare for a 7:30 class. And I'm not very good in the morning. This is my time of the morning. So at that point I decided, if I cannot really have time to prepare for classes and do it well, I don't think it's right for either the students or me to try to do it on the run. You're not available to students, or at least in my situation, I was not available the way I thought I should be.
Sure.
So I decided, until I know I'm going to have time to do it right, I don't think I should try to teach. And I never really felt that I had time to do it as it should be done. You know, one of our current overarching goals is to be student-focused. Now that's I think we have a long tradition of that, and I think we really should try to put our students first, and one way to do it is to make sure that we're accessible to them when they need to visit with us.
Before we leave that, excuse me, a little earlier we talked about campus politics, politics at the university as well. Did you, when you were still in the political science department, did you get involved in that with the faculty senate or any of these?
Yes, I did. I was a member of the faculty senate for 2 years. In fact, we served together,
Yes.
as I recall. For 1 year, I was chair of the Senate's Committee on Academic and Curricular Affairs, and then the next year, vice president of the Senate.
Now that's a little unusual. You were still a fairly new faculty member. These are elective positions. How did you get known well enough among the faculty so people would vote for you?
Well, I don't know. Apparently I made friends. I enjoy meeting with people.
Mm-hmm.
As you probably recall, there was at that time a faculty lunchroom, and I ate there regularly and met a lot of people. And
yeah, that was an important institution, that faculty lunchroom.
It was.
I'm really sorry that it disappeared.
Very enjoyable. Actually, what happened was I wasn't all that well known, but there was a general ballot. I think at that time the College of Arts and Sciences had 8 or 10 members of the Senate, maybe 12. There was an initial ballot, and I was tied with another individual for last place on the ballot. Well, we had a runoff, and I won, I think, by a vote. But that gave me enough name recognition that then I
One vote? You didn't? Did you need a recount?
I didn't need a recount, although you know, having
at this point in December, 1st of December, at year 2000, this is
that's right.
It's particularly interesting, isn't it? Because we've been through the presidential.
Indeed, and I think recount is going to be a part of our major part of our vocabulary for a long time.
All right.
But at that time it wasn't, and the other individual did not ask for a recount, although perhaps the dean's office did one. There weren't that many votes at the time, and I don't think there were any dimpled chads either.
Okay. Well, let's. Is there anything particularly that happened in the faculty senate when you were there that you remember?
Well, at the time we drafted a new constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, it was a university senate with 5 administrative members. The people at the time thought we really should have a faculty senate So it would be much more an institution of faculty governance. In fact, I think at that time, as we changed from a municipal university to a state university, there was a lot of interest in expanding the faculty role in decision making, and this was a part of it. So we drafted a constitution that, among other things, provided for exclusively faculty membership.
Very interesting. Well, then you went on to become assistant and later associate vice chancellor for academic affairs.
Yes.
We talked a little bit, or you mentioned a little bit, some of the special assignments that you've had. Let's talk some more about those. You mentioned being library director for a year. How did that happen?
Well, we had a problem in the library. The director, and I'm not sure of all the details, and they wouldn't, even if I knew them, they wouldn't be too appropriate here. But the director was removed. The associate director became acting director, but indicated that he was a candidate for another position, and if he were offered the position, he would take it.
That was Ray Means.
That was Ray Means.
Right.
And
who went to become director of the library at Creighton.
That's correct.
And has since had an untimely demise. But
yes, he was a great person, and I think it would have been wonderful.
Good friend of mine and a good friend of the university's, even after he went to Creighton.
Indeed. Anyway, Ray took the job at Creighton, and they needed someone, and it was, given the divisions within the library staff at that time, it was determined that, well, it would be better to have someone serve as acting director who was simply not a part of the division. And I must have been sitting in the wrong place at the wrong time, but they asked me to go and serve as acting director.
I thought maybe it was just Herb figured you didn't have enough work to do in your...
Well, that may have been it. That could have certainly been it. We thought at the time that it would be a very brief period. A search was underway for a new director.
I know that very well because I chaired that committee.
Yes.
And you and I worked closely together.
That's right, we did. Unfortunately, the initial search was not successful. We had some good candidates, but they did not work out, so it had to be reopened. And although the assignment was thought to be only about a 3 or 4 month one, turned out to be a year. But the search committee had a much more successful round when the search was reopened, and Bob Runyon was selected and took the job, and I think had a very, very distinguished career here.
You just retired a year ago.
I enjoyed Bob a lot.
Less than a year ago.
He did a wonderful job, and I think he was exactly the right person for that time, and indeed the entire time he was here.
And he's been interviewed in this series too, and if any of our listeners want to see that tape, it's available at the UNO library.
And I'm sure it would be a very good one.
You had a number of other special projects. One I remember is that you went to Afghanistan.
Yes, I did. We've had a very active involvement in Afghanistan, dating back to the early 70s when Chris Young worked out a contract. Tom Gutierrez, of course, came in, and Tom had served with the Peace Corps in Afghanistan.
He became director of the Center for Afghanistan Studies here, and later Dean for International Studies.
Yes. In the mid-80s, we were invited to bid on a contract with the Agency for International Development to provide educational services to Afghanistan.
This was after the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, and when the infrastructure of the country was all shot, and
yes.
They needed help in the, well, they had no school system, essentially.
Indeed, they had absolutely no school system.
And our contract was to provide some kind of school facilities, at least textbooks and a few things like that.
Yes, textbooks and hire instructors and pay the instructors, train them, etc. Unfortunately, Tom became ill just at the time that he was going to go to Pakistan and negotiate the contract with AID, whose offices for that particular area were
That's a U.S. Agency for International Development.
Their offices were in Islamabad. So at the time, Tom reported to me, and I went over very hurriedly to complete the contract. It was a very, very interesting experience. I thought I had really accomplished something, because in the negotiations we came out with $2,000 more than we had originally proposed. So and we had expected to get a good deal less at the time. Anyway, it was a fascinating experience, and then a couple of years later I went over as a consultant on a project to look at the feasibility of establishing an Institute for Public Administration that would help develop the infrastructure in Afghanistan once the Russian occupation had ended. Well, it was a very fascinating time. I spent a month there, met with a variety of leaders of the 9 Afghan political parties that were combating the Russians, and prepared a report that indicated that this was something that should be done to aid in the development of the infrastructure of the country later. Well, as things developed, that did not come to pass, and I think all of us were very saddened by the turn of events. We were delighted when the Russians left, but then the Afghans unfortunately began worrying with themselves, and the country remains a very, very in a very difficult situation.
That educational support project was a very successful project, though, and I worked there, you may remember, for
yes, I do
4
recall.
summers myself.
You went over there and helped them with their computers, as I recall.
Yeah, it was a very rewarding
I thought the
experience.
project itself was absolutely amazing, and it provided really the only education that children were able to receive in Afghanistan at that time, and it
was
at
an
least
important project.
Kept the flame of learning alive.
Another project that I know you were involved in was the formation of the Aviation Institute here at UNO.
Yes, some community leaders in Omaha thought that we had a great potential for establishing an aviation program. Otto Bauer and I developed a proposal for forming the institute. It was funded by a group of community leaders, including Walter Scott, Chuck Durham, Mike Harper, and I think there was another individual. We had a good deal of help from Don Smithy, the executive director of the airport. The regents approved it, and it got underway in roughly 1990. It's been a very fascinating experience. The program has absolutely thrived. Currently, I don't recall the current enrollment of the program, but it certainly has far outstripped our expectations.
And probably a good deal of that success is attributable to its initial director and his successor.
Yes, indeed. They provided outstanding leadership, involvement with the community.
And currently Brent Bowen is in the news, well, fairly recently with his annual survey of the airlines.
Yes, he does this, and he has a quality rating of about 15 to 20 various factors that are pulled together to rate the 9 or 10 top airlines of the country. And it's a very interesting thing, and what is interesting is to see the variation among the airlines, although my impression of Brent's work is that quality is not exactly improving.
The activity that I suppose I spent more time with you on than anything else was your involvement in accreditation programs for the university. Want to say a little bit about that?
Sure.
You're accredited by the North Central Association, right?
Yes, UNO's accrediting body is the North Central Association of Colleges and Schools, and more specifically, the Commission on Institutions of Higher Education of NCA. The first accreditation review that I was involved in was in 1976, when Ron Roskins was Chancellor and Herb Garfinkel Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs.
And I was a very new Dean of Arts and
And you were
Sciences
a very new Dean, and I think you were involved in that one too.
Yes.
And that, I think that the work that went into that and the visit of the team, which was a very, very positive experience, I think that marked a kind of coming of age of the institution at that time. We had not yet been fully accredited by North Central. We had been accredited at the specialist level a few years before, but there were some problems noted, and a couple of programs at that level had not been approved. And so we were looking to obtain North Central's full approval without any conditions, and did it.
And we got it for 10 years.
We got it, and
we've had 10-year accreditations ever since.
Indeed. We got it in 1976, again in 1986, and 86, 87, and then most recently in 96, 97. And at that time, we were accredited fully at the doctoral level, and that marked quite a bit of quite an accomplishment. And when I refer to the accomplishment, it's really largely that of the institution.
Are you likely to be in that office for the next one, or?
I don't think I will be. I think 3 is enough for anybody.
Think you may be retired by then?
I think I will be.
Okay.
But each one was a great experience, and in each case we had wonderful people working on the self-study, and even more importantly, great people doing a lot of great things. A self-study has to have accomplishments.
Very briefly, for the benefit of those people who are listening to us talk today, who are not affiliated with a university, could you just say something about what accreditation means and what's involved in it?
Well, accreditation is a very important thing for institutions of higher education. There are regional accrediting bodies for every major region of the country. Ours is the North Central Association. Each of the accrediting bodies has its own criteria. North Central's is essentially, does the institution have a mission that is appropriate to an institution of higher education? Is it carrying out its mission? Can it continue to do so? And there are other ones as well, but those are the 3 key things. And
they evaluate this by sending a team of people here.
Yes, the institution does a self-study, which in our case was roughly a 200-page document each time. Then a review team of 7 to 9 individuals for an institution of this size comes. They're educators. They're our colleagues in other institutions in the region. They spend roughly 2.5 days visiting, well, indeed, anybody they care to visit with. But in general, the chancellor, the vice chancellor, deans, and faculty in a variety of departments.
And students too sometimes.
Students as well. They go, and staff, each person is assigned a particular component of the university. And
it's not just the academic component, but it's also student services, and the financial end of things. I mean, the total
the entire institution is
it's a big job.
Under reviewed. It really is, and I've always been impressed at the seriousness with which the individuals approach this task, and the effort, the energy they put into it. The last time in particular, I recall the team had its meeting room in the Academic Affairs Conference Room. And at the end of the day, late in the afternoon, I would see them come in, and they were visibly tired, energized in a way by the people they had met with, because I think they draw out the best in people. They have really good interactions. These are not pro forma discussions. These individuals had put a lot into it, and were clearly pretty exhausted by the effort. But they were not so exhausted that they didn't write an extremely positive report about the institution. It was a highly complimentary report, and we were very, very proud of it.
Well, that's in no small part due to the prodigious effort that you and your colleagues and staff exerted in all of these accreditation visits, actually.
Well, thank you, Jack. But
it's a big job, and you deserve a lot of credit for it.
Well, thank you. But the members of that self-study committee also deserve a lot of credit, because all of them put a great deal into it.
Now, currently, I think we mentioned right at the start of this talk that one of your titles is Dean of the College of Continuing Studies. You want to tell us how that came about?
Oh,
That's fairly recent, isn't it?
Yes, it is. That occurred at the 1st of February of this year. As you know, there has been a good deal of reorganization in the College of Continuing Studies. We no longer operate the conference center at the old Peter Kiewit Conference Center downtown. We basically discontinued all non-credit activities, credit activities there, and conferences and institutes. And it was decided that, given that reorganization and downsizing, that we didn't really need to have a separate dean. And so that was added to my list of responsibilities.
Imagine that saved the university some money too.
Well, I think that was the idea, and I think it is. I think it has worked very well. I've always my main job deals with the Bachelor of General Studies program, which is I think a wonderful opportunity for adults in the community. It's intended for adults to help them finish a college degree. It was developed roughly 50 years ago.
Yes.
In fact, we just celebrated 50 years of offering classes off at Air Base. And
if we had time, we could explore that, because I'm sure you had bootstrapper students in your classes.
Oh,
when
I
you
did.
First came here.
Back in the
But
early.
we're getting close to the end of things here. Actually, time has flown this morning.
Time flies.
I'd
when you're
like to
having
take
fun.
just a minute or two to ask you about any special reminiscences you have about people or occurrences or anything that you might like to talk for a minute or two about.
Well, Jack, the people that I have encountered at UNO have been absolutely remarkable.
We mentioned Herb Garfinkel earlier. He's certainly at the top of my list for important people that I've known over the years.
Herb set the tone, and I think really set the academic side of the institution on a path of enhanced quality and rigor, and I think he did a wonderful job. Otto Bauer succeeded him. I think you have interviewed Otto. Otto has done did a superb job in keeping that momentum going and building bridges with the faculty at a time when there was a bit of difficulty. Currently, Derek Hodgson is our Vice Chancellor. He's been here. This is his third year, and he too is providing really, really strong leadership. It's been great to work with them and countless faculty that I've had the opportunity to work with over the years.
Well, great. I'm sure there are many, many other people we could talk about if we had the time this morning. But as I said, we're fast running out of time. I'm just wondering if we had time for. Tell us about that incident that you mentioned earlier to me when you, if you could do it in 30 seconds.
Okay. Well,
I thought that was amusing.
In the old Office of Academic Affairs, Herb Garfinkel, Elaine Hess, and I noticed a rather odd aroma on a few days, and didn't think a whole lot about it. But then one of our colleagues, the ombudsman at the time, came in and said, "Who's been smoking pot in here?" Well, we were all so naive, we didn't know what pot smelled like.
It turned out to be one of the custodians.
It turned out to be a custodian
who
came in the evenings and made himself at home.
Well, I think we're at the end of our discussion this morning. I want to thank you very much, John, for joining me.
I've enjoyed it, Jack.
I think it's been fun. I've learned a few things, and I want to our audience, I want to thank you for joining us today in a visit with Dr. John Farr, longtime Associate Professor of Political Science and Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. We've been taking a look at some of the history of UN Omaha as seen through the eyes of the history makers. And this is Jack Newton, inviting you to join us again for the series we call Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.